Welcome back. Welcome back to the Total Confidence Podcast. I'm your host, Ahmad Wazir. Season 3, Episode 3. Got a special treat for you today. With over 25 years of experience in performance improvement, clear thinking, and decision making, and the Enneagram model of personality styles, Mario Sikora is a trusted leadership advisor and coach to senior executives worldwide. He is the CEO of Awareness to Action International, a global network of coaches, consultants, and human resources and organizational development professionals. They help organizations of all sizes develop effective leaders and teams using the Enneagram. Mario has created an innovative approach to the Enneagram that integrates psychological, behavioral, and leadership insights to help individuals and groups reach their full potential. He has advised and trained leaders and their teams in various industries, such as manufacturing, telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, security, banking, finance, private equity, and venture capital. He is also the author or co-author of 5 books and is a leader in the Enneagram community. Welcome to Total Confidence, Mario Sikora.
Ahmad, it's a pleasure to be here, my friend. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure's mine. Pleasure's mine.
That's a lot of stuff in that bio. It almost sounds like I wrote it myself.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Yeah, been full life so far, right?
I got to say, Ahmad, we can see each other on video here, and I just love the way you wear a hat, man. We met briefly. Unfortunately, we didn't have much time to talk at the IEA conference this summer. But, I would see you across the way and I'm thinking, man, I wish I could rock a pork pie like that guy. Kudos on the hat, as a beginner.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Inspired from my favorite fictional 5, Walter White on Breaking Bad, by the way.
Oh, okay. That's great. So for me, it brought Charles Mingus to mind, but Walter White's a good way to go too.
I appreciate it. So I guess you answered the question prior to we coming on. Where are you from originally?
So I'm from the Philadelphia area, born and raised in Delaware County, outside of Philadelphia, and I've lived in the Philadelphia area my whole life.
How has being from Philly shaped your worldview and the work that you do now?
That's a great question. So I love Philadelphia, right? I've had the good fortune in my work to travel all over the world, right? I've been really lucky that way. I've been to 5 continents, 25, 30 countries, lots of great cities. And I love Philadelphia. And the thing I love about Philadelphia is that it's a working class city, right? It's very much Rocky, right? If you've ever seen Rocky, the patron saint of Philadelphia, Philadelphia is working class. It's got an attitude, right? It's got a big heart, got an attitude. It is a no nonsense blue collar kind of town. And that's how I see myself. Even though I get to work with, people, CEOs and that sort of thing, I'm a Philly boy at heart. And, I think it shapes my sort of no nonsense approach to things in a good way. I will say that I am a better sports fan than most people from Philadelphia are. We got a real reputation of being pretty brutal as sports fans. I try to be a little kinder than that.
But, are you an Eagles fan?
I am, but I don't get to follow sports as much as I used to. I've got 4 boys, 2 of whom are just all about sports. And my 14-year-old watches Red Zone from 1:00 on Sunday afternoon until the last game is over. But I just don't have as much time to follow as I would have liked to.
Understood. So Mario, how did you first discover the Enneagram, and what was your first impression of it?
Yeah, so I started my career as a writer and editor, and went into corporate communications and was doing some training work and really enjoyed that. And an uncle of mine who knew about the Enneagram was actually working with Don Riso and Russ Hudson back in the mid 90s. he and his brother had been to the first IEA conference. I think they were getting ready to go to the first IEA conference at Stanford in 1994. And I was hanging out with them one evening, and they started telling me about the Enneagram. And I was familiar with personality models before. I knew about the Myers-Briggs and DISC and some other things, and always kind of found them interesting, but never, I was not like a fanatic about them or anything. So they said, "Oh, you should read this book by Don Riso." And so I was in, a few days later, I'm in Philadelphia. I buy a copy of Riso's personality types. It was the first edition, the brown one, that was thinner, not the second edition orange one.
Oh yeah.
And I sat down and I started reading, and they had said to me, take a look at this chapter on the type 8. Right? And I started reading it. I remember sitting at the Market East train station in the 8th and Market in Philadelphia. And I was so absorbed in the book that I missed my train. Right. I was sitting there reading it and just lost. And I was blown away, man. I'm thinking, man, this is interesting. It captured me better than any other model I'd come across. And I started thinking, this is useful too. That was one of the big things about it, is I can use this in some way. So I sat there reading, for another hour until the next train came, and, got home, and I've been hooked ever since.
Beautiful, beautiful. So
29 years ago.
Wow.
29 years ago. Yeah.
Wow. How has your view, when you originally discovered it, reading that book, from then to now, how has it evolved? What is the difference between the way you viewed the Enneagram initially until now?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I am of the view that knowledge evolves, right? That insights evolve, that and that it should always be evolving. I'm a big fan of the philosopher Karl Popper. Okay, I've got a philosophy background, and so Karl Popper's perspective is that all knowledge is provisional, and once you have an explanation of something, a theory of something, you should then focus on error correction, right? Finding out how to make it better, how to make it more accurate, how to, refine it. And now when I encountered the Enneagram, I sort of took it, like I think a lot of people do, sort of as gospel, right? Again, this is a long time ago, right? So it's like, and I was more, inclined to the mystical back then than I am now. And because I've also got a seminary background, and I was really interested in spirituality, still am, but in a different way. So when I learned the Enneagram, I sort of took what I read in books as the facts, right? As the scripture almost, right? Yeah. And then as you start reading these different authors, you start reading, wait a minute, man, this scripture contradicts this one, or there's this little issue here, and so forth. Okay. So, that caught my attention. It got me thinking about it. And then, but the big change was when I actually started using it in organizations. Okay. Because, when you work with people in the business world, they're skeptical. Okay. They're skeptical of everything. They're rigorous, right? They, and when they get somebody to come in and, this guy's going to tell us about personality types today, right? The first thing they want to do is figure out how you're full of crap. Okay? They want to say, yeah, that doesn't make any sense, or, this or that. So I started encountering, challenges with some of the things I had learned, right? Some of the ideas didn't quite hold up as well as I thought they would in the real world. The other thing I started to see was that, when you're teaching this in the business world, you don't have as much time to with people, right? You're working with a group of, like, for example, in 2 weeks, I'm doing a session with the top of the house of a $50 billion bank. Okay. So these are very serious senior people. I have an hour and 15 minutes to explain the Enneagram to them. Okay. Now, I can say to myself, well, that just can't be done, right? You can't capture the Enneagram in that amount of time. Or I can figure out how to do it. Yeah. I can figure out, how do you present the Enneagram in a way that's concise, that's digestible, that is still accurate and robust, but gets to the audience. So I started working with the language of the Enneagram with that in mind. Okay. How do I clarify these concepts in a way that people can grasp them more quickly? How do I make the examples and the fundamentals more precise so that people don't need to remember all of the details? They just need to remember, for example, so I believe you're an Enneagram type 5. Is that correct?
That's
Okay.
correct. Yeah.
All right. So with the 5, when I first started learning the Enneagram, it would say, well, 5s are like this, and they're like this, and they do this, and they like to read, and blah, 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 all these traits, all these characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great because it helps you understand.
Mm-hmm.
But people can't remember that when they're learning it in a short time, and they're not trying to be Enneagram experts.
Mm-hmm.
So I started asking myself, okay, how do I capture what it means to be a 5 or what it means to be an 8 or a 7 in a way that sticks with people? And so I came up with this idea of adaptive strategies, right? That each of these types are strategies that they're all rooted in a desire to feel a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it about the 5? What is it at the heart that is guiding the way they feel, the way they think, the way they behave? And it was this strategy of striving to feel detached. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I want to create a little buffer between myself and the emotional messiness of the world, right? It's not that I don't have love. It's not that I don't care about people. It's not that I don't interact with people, but I just want to keep this little buffer here, right? To kind of make me feel like everything's okay. Now, with the 8, on the other hand, it's striving to feel powerful. Okay. How do I impact things? How do I make change? How do I, be the master of my own universe, so to speak? Now, by getting the phrase right in this way, putting it in a way that people could remember it, I don't need to remember everything about an 8, that they do this, they don't do that, so forth. I just remember, what can somebody who's striving to feel powerful look like? How would that express in the world? How would that manifest? And I can figure out 80% of it on my own, right? If you have the right starting point. Mm-hmm. So part of my work was to figure out what those starting points are. Mm-hmm. I also, and I hope you'll indulge me here, but you asked the question of how did my thinking evolve, and it's evolved a lot, right? So I got a lot to say on this topic. Right?
Absolutely.
So I started also seeing that there were some pieces of the literature that maybe they're accurate, maybe they're helpful, but they add layers of confusion and complexity that may undermine the contribution they give. Okay, so certain things that a lot of people teach, some of the nuances, some of the refinements, wings, for example. I don't teach wings, and there's a couple of reasons for that. But one of them was I started noticing everybody was getting caught up. Well, I don't know if I'm this wing or that wing, or I think she's this wing and not that wing, and so forth. So I started to say, okay, well, if this is taking us away from understanding, then I'm not going to teach it. I'm going to stick with the things that reinforce understanding, at least initially. Right. And then we can get into some of the nuances down the road. So refining it and sort of narrowing down what I teach was a big part of it, too. And the final thing I'll say is that, around the instinctual biases, what I call the instinctual biases, there's been a lot of change in the way I think about that for a number of reasons. Number one is that I don't think the existing literature is congruent with what we know about human nature through biology and science. And I also think that the language that's commonly used only captures a slice of what's happening in those domains rather than the bigger picture. So I'd say those are the big things there, right? Getting precise and more concentrated in the language, shaving off some of the stuff that I didn't think added as much value, and then really re-envisioning the instinctual biases.
Thank you. Because you use a different language. I see.
I do.
So how did you come about using the terminology you use? Use
preserving, navigating, and transmitting.
Okay.
Yeah. So so there were a couple of things happening there. So when I was first learning the Enneagram, at least in the, what I think of as the East Coast. So back then there was like the East Coast and the West Coast, of the Enneagram. It was kind of like the rap wars in the 90s, it was, so, on the East Coast, the instinctual, the subtypes were not as focused on, Don and Russ started focusing a lot more on that in the later 90s. And then when Wisdom, the Enneagram came out, and so it was fairly new to me. And, as when I first started learning it, I thought, okay, this is interesting, but it wasn't, it didn't seem hugely helpful to me. But the more I got into it, the more I started to see, hey, wait a minute, there is something here, right? It does help to know that, using the traditional language, I'm a social 8. Okay. And so it helps to know that a social 8 is different from a sexual 8, from a self-pres 8. But I started to, number one, you encounter problems with the language. Okay. You can't go into a company in a corporate environment and say, well, Joe is a sexual subtype, right? It's just, right. That's a problem for starters. Okay. So, absolutely. So the thing, I switched to the language of one-on-one that a lot of people use. But then I also started noticing that a lot of people that I would encounter had misidentified themselves. People who I saw, people that I worked with who I saw as clearly self-pres types, identified as one-to-one. And it was because the language was too close. They would say, oh, I'm one-on-one because I like to interact with people one-on-one, or I like small groups or something like that. Well, what I started to find was that the preserving types enjoyed that just as much. But preservers don't like big groups. They like tight, close relationships as well. So I started noticing not only was the language a little bit problematic, but it wasn't capturing what was really at the heart of these things. And it wasn't capturing the scope of the behaviors that I was noticing that were correlated. So for example, you stick with the one-to-one or the sexual, I started seeing this tendency of people to peacock a little bit, right? Of sort of to glitter in a way, to sparkle, to act in ways that drew attention to them, even if it wasn't necessarily to connect with the other person. Like when a peacock spreads its feathers, it's not saying, hey, you peahen, I want you. It's saying to all the peahens, come and get it, baby. Right. Right. So it's sending out, it's broadcasting a message to everybody. Hey, I'm desirable. Come pay attention to me. Right. And so I started noticing these behaviors correlated with people who had that subtype. Right. There was this tendency they had to stand out in certain ways. I also started to notice that people who were so-called social were not always very social. Right. Honestly, I'm not the most social person in the world. I can be, and I like people. I find people interesting. When I'm around people, that's great. But I'm actually kind of an introvert. Okay. And I started seeing people thinking, oh, social means extroverted. And so I started seeing a lot of people who were actually transmitters misidentifying as quote unquote social, something I still see. The other thing I noticed in the preserving domain is it's not just about the self. Right. It's this idea that I like to preserve things in general. I like to preserve pictures of my family. I like traditions, right? I like to study, genealogy, and I like to garden, and I like to do anything that involves keeping things as they are and in a good state of repair. So I started thinking about this. Okay, I'm seeing a bigger picture here. What explains that bigger picture, right? What is terminology that explains all of these things and not just some of them, right? So if you think self-preservation, okay, it's more than just about the self. So what is it, right? Well, it's preservation in general. With the social thing, all right, it's not really being social. What is it? It's about navigating the group. It's about understanding group dynamics and how I fit into them. Okay. Absolutely. What is my place? Where am I on the hierarchy? How does this group work? Okay. And with the, sexual, it wasn't, again, sex is a very specific term, right? In biology and science, it's sex. Okay. It's, and so, well, yes, sex is part of it, but what else is happening? it's behaviors that increase the probability that I'll pass my genes on, right? I'm more outgoing, I'm more, colorful, I'm more sparkly, and so forth. So I picked terms that I felt best captured what I saw. Now, the other piece to this is that I went with verbs: preserving, navigating, transmitting, because for me, the Enneagram should be about verbs, not about nouns. Okay. It's not what I am, it's what I do. Now, I'm not just saying it's a trait or a behavior, because the motivation of why I do it is important, but I can't understand your motivation if I don't understand what it is you're actually doing in the first place. Okay. So for me, I look at, is somebody not, are you a preserver, but are you preserving? Okay. I look at what somebody does, what they pay attention to. When I interview people, I ask them about their hobbies, right? What do you like to spend your time doing? And people's hobbies almost always reflect their instinctual bias. Okay. So for me, verbs are important rather than nouns, for a variety of reasons. Okay. In addition to being more accurate, it also gives us a sense of freedom, right? Your Enneagram type is not what you are, it's what you do. And I have some control over what I do. Okay. I can change, I can grow. I might not become a different type, but I can modify my behaviors. It doesn't feel like a trap.
That makes sense. Me being social, navigating, I'm always talking about, that's one of my favorite words, actually, navigating through groups, navigating how I fit in. As the expert, So very, very interesting. What are some of the biggest misconceptions or outright falsehoods about the Enneagram you've seen come up in this work?
It's interesting because, so, you go back to the mid 90s when I first heard about the Enneagram, first started working with it. Nobody knew anything about the Enneagram, right? I mean, you couldn't find, there were some books, that sort of thing, but the internet wasn't really a thing yet. So there wasn't all this information. So nobody really knew about it. And so the control over it, in the sense, meaning the quality, I think, was a bit tighter. Now the internet comes along, I don't know anybody who hasn't written an Enneagram book these days, right? I mean, so,
right.
Right. So, I've seen people, for example, one of the big places that the Enneagram has taken off is in the churches, which I think is great. Okay. So particularly the evangelical churches is one of the reasons the Enneagram has become so popular. But I've heard people say that it's like of the devil in some way, or it's, a kind of a pagan practice. That's just silly, right? That's not the experience. There are common misperceptions about the types. There were things, I remember one time at a conference that a guy comes up to me and starts talking to me about my book, and then asks me to read something he had written. And he hands me these couple sheets of paper, and he says, "Look, I know that 8s don't read, but this is short, And I'm thinking, all right, so you came up to me knowing I wrote a book, right? And you're going to assume that I don't read because I'm an 8. I mean, I got 6,000, 7,000 books in my house, I mean, so you hear stupid things like that sometimes. Okay. Now, one of the things that I find frustrating, that is, pretty common, is people saying that the Enneagram is an ancient typing system, right? I do not consider the late 1960s ancient, right? I was in grade school in the late 1960s, so I don't think it's that ancient. There's this mythology that has grown up around the Enneagram that it's this ancient thing. Now, if we're talking about the Enneagram as a model of different personality styles, that started with Oscar Ichazo, late 1960s, early 1970s. Okay. The Enneagram as a diagram precedes him, but not by that much. Okay. I mean, the earliest, indication we have of it as a diagram is with Gurdjieff. Okay. Now, Gurdjieff said, I got it from the Sarmoon Brotherhood, this, that, and the other thing. Sarmoon Brotherhood didn't exist. Okay. It's not a thing. It's a myth. It's just, it's a fantasy. Gurdjieff was a tale teller. Okay. He was a bit of a con man, right? He liked to, he'd go into town and he'd pay the kids to catch sparrows for him, and he'd paint them yellow and he'd sell them to people as, exotic, birds and stuff, and then get out of town before the rain came. Right. And, so good stuff. A lot of people think highly of Gurdjieff, and, it's some great stuff, but he made up a lot about the Enneagram. Plus he wasn't using it as a model of personality styles anyway. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there are some ideas that get incorporated into the use of the Enneagram that are quite old, right? I mean, and again, this is the evolution of knowledge, right? Knowledge builds off of, one thing to the next. Oh, I like that idea. I'm going to take it. I'm going to add it to this, but that doesn't mean the Enneagram is ancient. Okay. It means that some of the ideas that people teach along with the Enneagram personality have a long, intellectual tradition, and that's fine. Okay. But I think we have to be really careful if we want to be rigorous, if we want to be intellectually honest about not saying the Enneagram of personality is an ancient model, because it's just not.
Why is that taught so much? And I saw a video with Claudio Naranjo basically saying like, hey,
I just made it up.
Yeah. It's just kind of like,
yeah,
I saw that a while ago, and I was like,
it was a marketing ploy for Naranjo, right? I mean, he says it. There's people can Google the video on YouTube, or look it up on YouTube. I think it's called "The Origins of the Enneagram" or something, with Claudio Naranjo, and he's sitting there with these two other guys in somebody's basement or something, and and he says, yeah, I just I wanted people to accept my ideas. I stole a line from Oscar Wilde, who said, if you want people to take you seriously, say somebody important said it. Wow. And so he said, so I made up the thing about the Sufis. Now, look, I've been to Egypt probably 20 times. I know lots of, I know a bit about the history of Egypt. I've got a good friend who is a Sufi scholar, and and he just reached out to me. He says, look, I'm a Sufi scholar. I study this stuff. The Enneagram was not in the Sufis, right? It just is not there. And there are people now who teach the Sufi Enneagram and this and that, but they're just making that stuff up. Okay. I mean, I hate to say it, but they're just making it up. Now, are they honestly being deceptive? I don't think so. Right? Because we can talk ourselves into things that are cool. I mean, it's just really cool to think that something is really, really old and really ancient, and I'm tied into some deep hidden, knowledge that nobody else has, and if I'm not secure in what I'm teaching, I might need that to make me feel more confident, right? Oh, I'm just saying what all these wise people in the past have said, right? Yeah. Well, if you're, for me, it shows more intellectual integrity to say, yeah, it doesn't have to be old to be good. Okay. Quantum physics is not that old. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, and even though people working in quantum physics studied Newton, this does not mean that Newton knew quantum physics. Right. Right. So we have to say, okay, yeah, ideas build off of each other. That's the way of things. But at a certain point, and it was with Echazo, he said, hey, I've got this idea. Right. And boom, that's where it starts. Okay? Wow. So.
Wow.
I don't make any friends, Ahmad, when I come out.
What is it? I was thinking about the logical fallacy, appeal to authority.
That's exactly it.
Wow.
Appeal to authority, appeal to antiquity, right? There's a bunch of them, right, that people can fall into. And the brain loves stories. Right. And this is what the Enneagram tells us, right? Your Enneagram type is your story about how the world works. Okay. Mine is my story. Our stories are really different. Okay. We got a lot of common ground, I'm sure. We see certain things the same way. It's different. But in the way we think about the world, it's different because you come at it from a 5 perspective. I come at it from an 8 perspective. Right. The brain is making up stories all the time. Okay. Just an example. I see your hat. I start thinking about Charles Mingus. Okay. Then, and I start thinking, all right, and so I get this story about Ahmad, and, but your story is Walter White, Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
so my story of you was wrong. Okay. Or not wrong, but it was just, it was just a fiction that I made up. Okay. And this is what we're doing all the time. But the brain loves to create stories. Okay. It's doing it all the time. And
Absolutely.
so we need to have stories. There's a great line from the author Joan Didion who said, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live."
Mm.
And all of our traditions, all of our wisdom practices are about making sense of the world to give us comfort. And for a lot of people, knowing that something is really old and knowing that somebody in authority said it makes me feel more comfortable. Yeah.
Wow. So you don't make a lot of friends with this, right? Cognitive dissonance. uh,
But I say these things with love in my heart. Okay, I want to be clear on that. So
I get that. I mean, seriously, we're joking around, but I don't see any malice. I don't feel any
yeah,
malice in your intent. It's just like, let's cut it out. We don't have to do all this extra stuff to convey these ideas,
yeah, and 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 see the thing is too with these cognitive biases, these logical fallacies that you mentioned, we all do them all the time, right? I fall into them just as much as anybody else. If you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow was the book where he talks about cognitive dissonance and
Mm.
system one, system two thinking. And he was he won a Nobel Prize in economics. He was a behavioral psychologist, right? So he looked at these cognitive biases that we fall into, and he said, "I'm one of the leading experts in the world on how we fall into these biases, and I do it just as much as anybody else
Mm.
because that's how we're wired." So we have to be compassionate for ourselves, right? And recognize every wisdom tradition tells us we're easily fooled.
Mm.
Okay. St. Paul wrote, we see the world as through a glass darkly, right? The Sufis talking about you come into the world and there are 70,000 veils draped upon you, 35 of ignorance, 35 of illusion, right? 35,000 of illusion. And the path of growth is peeling off those layers of illusion, right? Those layers of ignorance and learning. And that's the path we're all on. Okay. But we don't progress on that path if we don't realize that, yeah, man, I'm just as prone to this as anybody.
Makes sense. Wow. What led to the founding of your business or your company, Awareness,
Awareness to
Action
action. Yeah.
International? And how would you describe the mission of your company?
Yeah. So I am passionate about helping people see more clearly so they can live their lives more skillfully. Okay? How, we're all looking for, again, flourishing, right? I love that Greek term of eudaimonia, which is about flourishing. How do we make the most of our potential? And the only way we can do that is if we can see ourselves and the world more clearly. The more clearly we see, the more skillful we can be in our actions. And so for me, that's my passion. Because I want to understand the world. I want to know how it works. I want to know what makes me tick, why I keep doing the same dumb things over and over again. Right. I like to say, my wife and I just celebrated our 22nd wedding anniversary. And I often tell people she gets angry with me over the same dumb things that she did 22 years ago. Right. I don't surprise her. I don't come up with new dysfunction and, that sort of thing. Right. It's just, she just, oh, you're doing it. Why do you do it? 22 years you've been doing the same dumb thing. So, so I am trying to figure out how do I do that less frequently? Okay. How do I do those things less extremely so that I don't anger my wife as frequently as I used to? Okay. I try to understand how I am when I interact with my kids so that I do as little damage to them as I can. Okay. We're all going to do some. You're a parent, right? You have kids?
I do.
Hey, how many?
We have 9. My wife and I have 9.
Nine.
Yes.
Nine. That's
Yes.
crazy, man.
Like we're
That's
old school, as you can see.
yeah, wow, that's great. How old are they?
Our oldest is 23 and our youngest is 6 and everything in
Wow.
between. Yes.
Wow. Good for you. Good for you. Wow. My mother was one of 11, man. It was a great thing. That Most of the time it was a great thing. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, raising kids is tough, man.
Yeah.
And if we fall into the traps of our personality, we're doing them a disservice. Okay. If we don't understand where they're coming from and why this kid acts differently from that one, and I have to say, okay, we'll treat this one differently than that one because they have different needs, right?
Yeah.
If I don't understand these things, I'll be less of a parent.
Yeah.
So it's all about, how do I become more skillful in the world in some way? So again, so I can reduce my suffering, so other people, and so I can cause less suffering to others. Now, way back, like I mentioned, I was in corporate communications and training, and I had the opportunity to join a little consulting group to start doing executive coaching and team building. And I did that for about a year, and then said, you know what, man, I do this better myself. Okay. And so I started my own business, and I said, I'm going to go off on my own. And I've been fortunate enough to, make a living at it for, all these years. My clients, again, they tend to be, they're corporations. They're, some really big companies, some small companies, some in between. Most of them are in the US, but I've done, worked with, companies around the world. Our mission is to, it's in the name, right? Awareness to action. People want to get better at what they do, because getting better at what you do, say you're working in a business. Okay. If a leader, an executive, is better at what they do, it makes life better for their employees. Okay?
Absolutely.
The company does better. That means that the stock price goes up. That means that you and I, who have money in our 401ks or whatever it is, we have a better retirement plan, and that sort of thing. So it's important for, everybody to flourish, but the people in the business world, for me, it's a great place to have high impact. Okay. So if I can touch people who touch a lot of people, then I'm having a kind of an amplified impact on the world. So that's why I like the corporate stuff. Plus it pays better, right? I mean, it's just, it's, you go where the money is, right? I got kids to feed, so, I got 2 in college, man. I got to make some money, right?
So the idealism and the realism meet right there. Right?
That's right. That's right. Let's call it what it is, man. So we do executive coaching, which is really where my heart is, because I like working with people one-on-one. I like having conversations about, what they're really struggling with, that sort of thing. I work with executive teams, so I'll, go to their, meetings and observe their, behavior and give them feedback, coach the individuals on the team, that sort of thing. And we also do Enneagram trainings, primarily for leaders and managers.
Awesome. Recently, and I'm sure in your work, you've seen the talk of emotional intelligence come up more and more.
Yeah.
In the workplace, and often when something becomes trendy, it can kind of just become cliche.
Yeah.
In your view, what exactly is emotional intelligence?
Yeah. So my first book that I co-wrote with Bob Talon is Awareness to Action, the Enneagram, Emotional Intelligence and Change. Right. So now, there you go. All right. So you're the one who bought it, huh? Right. At the time we started that book in, I think, around 2000, and Goleman's books were big then, right? All of a sudden everybody's talking about emotional intelligence. Okay. And we thought, all right, well, this is an interesting, different way to talk about the Enneagram. Okay. Now, in our book, I think we identify 16 emotional competencies. Goleman originally identified, I think it was 24. That just seemed like too many. They're a bit redundant. I think he narrowed the list down eventually. But what I've come to realize since then is that when we're talking about emotional intelligence, what we're really talking about is the ability to recognize our emotional states. Okay. What am I feeling right now? Am I angry? Am I sad? Am I frustrated? Am I feeling shame? What is it that I'm feeling? And then once we identify those emotional states, managing my reaction to them. So I feel angry. but I'm not going to act angry. And for me, that's emotional intelligence, right? You got to see it, you got to manage it. Okay.
Right.
Now, the other side to that is recognizing other people's emotional states. Okay. All right. Ahmad seems down. Okay. Let me manage my response to him. Okay. Let me reach out to him if he needs it. Ahmad seems angry right now. Okay. Let me give him a little space. Okay. Calm down. So emotional intelligence for me can be narrowed down to that. Now, that means I have to get better at recognizing my own states, right? And there's work that goes into that. It means I have to get better at recognizing other people's emotional states, and there's work that goes into that. But at its heart, if we can remember, recognize your emotions, manage your reaction to them, that's emotional intelligence for me.
Makes sense. Makes sense. I found in organizations, people tend to overinflate the importance of their particular areas of specialization or expertise, and greatly downplay the importance of other areas, which can lead to resentment and sometimes outright infighting. What are some of the strategies Awareness to Action International uses to extinguish these type of things?
Yeah. That sounds like personal experience there, Ahmad.
You can see that, right? You saw right through that, right?
I'm asking for a friend, right? As they're just saying it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And look, this is, and this is the thing the Enneagram teaches us so well, is that we all see the world through our own lens. Okay. We're all the hero of our own story. We're all the victim in our own stories. Okay. We all see the world through the lens of me. And now we have to overcome this. Okay. But we have to recognize what those stories are before we can start working with them. So again, if we understand, okay, I, Mario, am interacting with the world as striving to feel powerful, and I fall into believing that anybody who doesn't see the world that way has got a loose screw or something, right? No, they're not. They're just wired different. They see the world differently. Okay. Now we extend that out to, the functional aspects of a business. Okay. So you've got, the finance people saying, oh, those dumb engineers, they don't know what they're doing, who are saying those stupid salespeople, they keep misrepresenting and blah, blah, blah. And so what we work with people to do is say, okay, in the same way that you're seeing the world through your personality lens, you're seeing it through your functional lens too. So let's step back. And, the corporate speak for this is, let's start thinking at an enterprise level. Okay. So, so you'll start to see, for example, as people come up through the organization, I start out as an engineer. Okay. So I go from an engineer to an engineering manager to engineering director to an engineering vice president. And I'm thinking engineering. That's all that matters. That's what's important. Now, when I get to a certain level, I've got to still be focused on engineering, but I have to see how that fits into the big picture. And I have to see how all the elements are part of that big picture and important parts of that big picture. And so, again, this is what we're trying to help people do, to think at an enterprise level in the business world. And when it comes to the Enneagram, it's all about, not trying to get people to abandon their type, or, I would never say to you, hey, Ahmad, you know what, man, you got to stop being a 5, man. You got to start being an 8 or a 2 or something like that. You're going to look at me like I got 2 heads, right? You're going to tell me, get out of here. What I got to say to you is say, you know what, Ahmad, man, your 5 strategy brings these amazing gifts to, these amazing contributions to the world. Okay. Let's keep leveraging those. But also, let's start practicing expanding beyond that too. Okay. So you always got that to go back on. It's always going to be your specialty. Right. But we want to start now understanding, okay, well, where's Mario coming from on this, or what's my 9 colleague coming from on this, and so forth. Okay. So you have to both recognize and appreciate our tendencies, not try to get rid of them, not demonize them, not shame them, but use them more adaptively and develop the flexibility to stretch outside of them when I need to.
Makes sense. As we draw to a conclusion, I appreciate your time. I'm always respectful of
It's
time.
been fun.
Man, it's been fun, man.
So hey, before you wrap up here, before you go into your, before you start landing the plane here, tell me, man, how did you encounter the Enneagram first? I'm sure
So,
your listeners have heard, but I want to hear. So go
I
ahead.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
So when I had to be about 19.
Uh-huh. Wow.
My cousin and I and a couple of friends, we were in a rap group. We had our own rap group.
Really?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
All
And
right.
I mean, we didn't like take off or anything, but we
Right. Right.
really, really passionate about it. And I went over
Uh-huh.
his house to just record some music, and
Uh-huh.
he gave me this book,
Yeah.
Enneagram by Helen Palmer, and he was like, "Hey,
Okay.
man, you need to read this. I'm a four, and I think you're a four too, a tragic
Uh-huh.
romantic. I think that's what they refer to the four."
Yeah.
And I thought I was a four. I started reading it, and I was like, "This does make sense." Like,
Uh-huh.
okay, because I resonated a lot with the four,
Right.
and but because I lead with five, of course, I had to go and find every book I could find, and I found Wisdom of the Enneagram.
Yeah.
And when I took the little test in the beginning, I read the five, and I was like, "Oh my God!"
Yeah.
So I just
Yeah.
been. This was like 1996. So
Wow.
on
Wow.
and off, I had been just
Yeah.
reading it. I put it down. I pick it back up. I read it,
Right.
and I've done a lot of different stuff.
Right.
My wife said that Enneagram thing is your thing. You know, I know you like music, and I know you like writing
Uh-huh.
and all this stuff, poetry, spoken word, all this stuff, and just
Uh-huh.
artistic stuff. She said that Enneagram, that's your thing. So
Right.
I got a little more serious with it the last few years. So
Oh, nice. Nice. That's great. That's great. Now, do you use it in your work at all, or is it more, still a personal thing? Or
oh,
tell
I
me.
use it everywhere. With
Uh-huh.
children, starting with my children.
Yeah.
I got a son that's in college that's a type 6, and he called me today,
Uh-huh.
like, "Dad, I need to. What do you think?" And he bounces stuff
Right.
off of me, and I understand that he needs
Right.
that reassurance. And I got a daughter that's a 6, so I use it at home first and foremost.
Yeah. Yeah.
My wife is a type 2, so
Uh-huh.
weird, weird. Um, I use it. I do use it at work. I work for the
Uh-huh.
light rail system here in
Right.
Charlotte,
Right.
and I once I know what a person. I mean, of course, I don't know if I don't do a formal type of interview, but I can kind of.
Sure.
I know you're not supposed to type people, but I can kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah. You
see
get a feel.
characteristics, and I
Yeah.
take a different approach with it. So
Yeah.
I'm very, very effective with people. Like, people say you are really. They try to figure out, why are you so good with people.
Yeah.
You can talk to
Yeah.
anybody and everything, but I use the Enneagram in very practical ways. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's good. And for me, that's what it's all about, right? I mean, look, I think learning about ourselves is great, but if we're not applying it to our interactions with other people, right? If we're not putting this to work and living it and reducing suffering in the ways that you're talking about, right? Because even if you don't really know the other person's type, knowing that there are these types makes you just take a deep breath, right? And not be as reactive and be more compassionate and say, okay, we all got these scripts that we're running in our brains, right? So let me just calm down a little bit here and start to understand the script of the other person. So I think that's wonderful, man. I love hearing stories like that. That's great.
Thank
Yeah.
you. The last thing I'll say on that is we have a kitten now,
Uh-huh.
and my type 7 daughter and my wife called me with her in the background, and she was working me. And
Uh-huh.
I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "Our 7 is working those angles right." And my daughter laughs. They know Dad sees where y'all are coming from. So we have a kitten, but she had the story and reframed it and everything. And it's
That's
like, okay, all right. You working me,
I
but okay, I respect you putting the effort in. So
I hear you. My wife is a 7, and so we cycle through pets and all that. And it's like, and for me, it's like, okay, I know I'm going to lose this battle. We're going to end up getting this kitten, but I'm going to put it off as long as I can.
exactly.
I'm just going to try and slow roll this a little bit, right? So
Exactly. Exactly. So my last question to you, man,
yeah.
is what words of guidance would you offer, those who are aspiring to be Enneagram teachers, coaches, who are just coming into this, who are novices, or
Yeah.
people like me who've just been studying it for years as a hobby, but now kind of getting more serious into it? What would you
Yeah.
offer as words of guidance?
Yeah. So a couple of things, right? Number one, I don't think there's any tool that's better than the Enneagram for, doing this kind of work. There are a lot of great personality models out there, a lot of great tools for self-awareness. For me, the reason I've kind of devoted my life to working with the Enneagram is because I don't think there's anything better, right? So that's the one thing. But the thing I have learned, doing it this long, is a couple of things. Number one, slow down, right? I used to think that it was important to get people's types right away, to impress them with, oh yeah, you're an 8, or, whatever it is. And what I have learned is that even though I'm pretty good at this, right? I mean, it's what I do for a living for over 25 years, but anytime I work with somebody, I interview them, I say, hey, look, we talk to them, I interview them, I talk about the Enneagram, ask them where they fit. And I say, we're going to come up with a provisional hypothesis here, okay, on your type. Okay, based on what we're talking about, based on how you see yourself, let's go with the hypothesis that you're a 5. But new information comes in, new data shows up, we might change our minds, right? Because people are complex, right? People don't always reveal themselves right away. You can't just look at somebody and know what type they are, because you never know what, kind of day they're having, and that sort of thing. So slow down, be humble, and say, here's what I'm seeing. Okay, we'll sit with this for a while. Okay, but I might change my mind. And people respect that, right? I mean, when you're first starting, at least how I felt was, people aren't going to respect me if I say, well, I think you're this, but I'm not sure. Right. The reality is that people will say, okay, he's taking this seriously, right? He's not trying to force me into a box. Right. So that's one thing. The other thing is to, when you're working in an organization, the people you're working with are not looking to become Enneagram experts. So you don't have to teach them the whole thing, right? You don't have to come in and make people, okay, I'm going to force the whole Enneagram down your throat so you know this. No, you give them what they need. And if they're interested, you can give them more resources, that sort of thing. But the Enneagram needs to be a tool. Okay, so if I'm working with you as a 5, I'm not going to say, hey, Ahmad, I want to teach you the whole Enneagram, tell you all this stuff. No, it's like, hey, you know what? Here's what I see in people of your personality style. And so let's look at this. And so you give it to them slowly, a piece at a time, and follow their interest in how much they want to know. Okay. And always remember that if you can't translate this into some action, into some steps to take, into some efforts to change, then you're really just wasting their time.
Ooh. Wow. I appreciate that, man. And last but definitely not least, how can we learn more about you and your work, your books, and resources that you offer?
Sure. Thank you. So I have a link tree, Mario Sikora links. That's Sikora, and that's got links to all my stuff. We have a certification program that we're just about to launch. It's primarily online, but you can also go to Enneagram. Well, you'll find this on the link tree, but we got a lot of free resources on our website, a lot of videos, all that sort of stuff. I'm on YouTube. More Instagram and Facebook and whatnot, and I've started getting into TikTok. So
I see stuff. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, you like some stuff. Yeah, so I'm just kind of dumping stuff up there now, and then going to start taking that a bit more seriously soon. But so there's a lot of social media stuff out there, and people, if people want to get hold of me, Mario@awareness-to-action.com is my email address.
Awesome, man. I enjoyed this. We got to do this again.
It's a huge pleasure, man. I've enjoyed it, Ahmad. I'm glad we had the chance to talk.
Absolutely. This is Total Confidence Podcast. Our guest today, Mario Sikora. And it's been a blessing. And y'all stay tuned. Appreciate you, bro.